What if a crime happened inside a house while the world was still asleep? No forced entry, no clear suspect, and no simple answers waiting in the morning light. It began as a quiet night, the kind nothing is supposed to happen in, a home where everything looked ordinary, too ordinary. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, the moment was already fragile. People entered when they shouldn't have. Small decisions were made quickly and questioned much later. Nearly 3 decades have passed since that night. Not because the evidence disappeared, but because so much of it was touched, moved, misunderstood. A scene that should have been preserved wasn't. A timeline that should have been clear, fractured. One detail suggested one truth, another quietly contradicted it. And within hours, certainty began to slip away. Was it a tragic mistake, a failure of judgment? Or did the truth sit in plain sight, ignored simply because no one expected it to matter? Even today, investigators and experts return to the same questions. How did control vanish so quickly? Why did early choices make later answers impossible? This isn't a story about accusations, and it isn't about wild theories. It's about how a single night, handled the wrong way, can echo for decades. Because sometimes the most disturbing mysteries aren't about what we don't know, they're about what we missed when it mattered most. It was the early hours of December 26, 1996, in Boulder, Colorado. A quiet, well-off suburban town, the kind where neighbors felt safe, where families left porch lights glowing through winter nights, and where violent crime felt distant, almost unimaginable. Snow rested lightly on the streets. Christmas lights still glowed in windows. Inside one of those homes, the Ramsey family had spent the night doing what millions of American families were doing that same holiday, resting after Christmas celebrations, preparing for the days ahead, expecting nothing more than an ordinary morning. The house itself showed no signs of danger, no broken windows, no forced entry, no alarms triggered in the night. Everything appeared calm, almost too calm, but behind those closed doors, something was already wrong. Not loud, not chaotic, just quiet, unfolding slowly, unnoticed, while the rest of the neighborhood slept. By the time morning arrived, this peaceful family home would no longer be just another house on a suburban street. It would become a crime scene, a symbol of confusion, and eventually the center of one of the most debated, analyzed, and deeply divided investigations in American history. What makes this moment so unsettling isn't just what happened, it's how ordinary everything looked before it did. Because when nothing appears out of place, danger becomes harder to see, and mistakes become easier to make. And those early moments, those quiet hours when nothing seemed wrong, would later raise the most disturbing questions of all. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come from a scream or a broken door or a desperate call in the middle of the night. It came quietly, in the form of a handwritten ransom note, not a short warning, not a rushed message left in panic, but a long, carefully written letter placed inside the home itself. As its words were read, confusion began to settle in. Nothing about it felt typical. Nothing about it followed the patterns investigators were trained to expect. Fear spread quickly, authorities were contacted, and slowly the house began to fill with people. Family members moved through familiar rooms, searching for answers they didn't yet understand. Officers entered spaces that had been private only hours before. Voices echoed through hallways that had been silent all night. And with every step, the situation became more fragile. Then attention turned downward, to a closed basement door, a space that hadn't mattered until suddenly it did. What was found there would change everything, not just the direction of the investigation, but its future. From that moment on, nothing about this case followed a normal course. There was no clear sequence, no clean transition from discovery to understanding. Instead of clarity, there was overlap. Instead of control, there was uncertainty. Decisions were made quickly in an atmosphere filled with shock and disbelief. And almost immediately questions began to surface about what had been seen, what had been touched, and what could no longer be undone. This was no longer just a crime scene. It was the beginning of a confusion that would never fully untangle itself. Investigators began examining the evidence closely, and almost immediately something felt off. The ransom note became the first major point of confusion. Not because ransom notes are unusual, but because this one didn't behave like any they had seen before. It wasn't short, it wasn't rushed, it wasn't written under obvious pressure. Instead, it was long, detailed, and strangely specific. Why was it written inside the house? Why did it reference exact amounts of money? Why did its tone shift between formal and personal? And most importantly, why did it feel like it didn't belong to the crime it described? As analysts examined the note, handwriting comparisons failed to deliver certainty. Linguistic patterns raised possibilities but never conclusions. Meanwhile, other evidence began telling different stories. Some clues suggested events happened earlier in the night. Others implied they occurred much later. One detail pointed forward in time, another quietly pulled the timeline backward. Witness accounts added to the uncertainty. Memories conflicted, descriptions changed, key moments were recalled differently by different people. Physical evidence offered no clear resolution either. Certain items appeared out of place. Other expected indicators were missing entirely. And some findings raised more questions than they answered. Instead of narrowing the investigation, the evidence pulled it apart. Each new theory fit one piece but contradicted another. Every explanation solved one problem while creating two more. Investigators faced a growing problem, too many directions, and no reliable way to eliminate any of them. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the case became increasingly complex, not because evidence was absent, but because it refused to align. What should have formed a clear narrative remained fragmented, disconnected, unstable, and slowly the investigation reached a dangerous point where uncertainty itself became the biggest obstacle. Because when evidence doesn't add up, truth doesn't disappear. It becomes buried under contradictions, assumptions, and questions no one can confidently answer. As time went on, the mistakes made in the earliest hours became impossible to undo. The crime scene, once full of potential answers, had already been compromised. Small actions, taken without hesitation, now carried consequences no one could reverse. Critical details were questioned, not because they were unclear, but because they had been altered, moved, or observed too late. As days passed, the investigation began to change. What started as a search for truth slowly turned into something else. Media attention intensified, speculation filled headlines, public pressure grew louder than evidence, and the case became a national spectacle, examined, debated, and judged long before facts could settle. Multiple theories emerged. Each one explained something, and each one failed to explain everything. Some pointed inward, others outward, but none could be proven beyond doubt. DNA testing brought hope, and then frustration. It ruled out certain possibilities but failed to identify a clear suspect. Instead of answers, it created another layer of uncertainty. Years passed, technology improved, new tools promised clarity. But the core mystery remained untouched. Investigators returned again and again to the same unresolved questions. What exactly happened that night? Why did the evidence refuse to align? And how did a case with global attention lose its direction so early, Bahi, before it ever had a chance to recover? This wasn't just a failure of evidence. It was a failure of timing, of control, and of decisions made when clarity mattered most. And once that moment was lost, it could never truly be reclaimed. Decades later, the case remains officially unsolved. No arrests, no convictions, no moment where justice finally arrived. What remains instead are theories layered over theories, questions stacked upon unanswered questions, and a truth that never fully surfaced. Investigations have been reopened more than once. New leads were promised. Hope returned briefly, only to disappear again. The house itself is quiet now, as if nothing ever happened there. Snow still falls, lights still turn off at night. Life continues, but the silence carries weight. The files may be closed, yet they are not resolved. They rest not as conclusions, but as reminders of what went wrong. Because this was never just a mystery of what happened, it was a failure of when, a moment where control was lost, where early decisions shaped decades of uncertainty. And history has a way of hiding the truth, not by erasing it, but by burying it beneath mistakes. Yet today, the story is not entirely finished. Modern forensic science has reopened questions that once had no answers. Advances in DNA testing, techniques unavailable at the time, have brought this case back into focus, not because the truth has been found, but because it may finally be heard. The question is no longer just what happened that night, it is whether today's technology can uncover what was missed, ignored, or misunderstood when it mattered most. Perhaps the answers are still out there, waiting not in the past, but in the evidence we are only now capable of understanding. And in the next chapter of this story, we may finally learn whether truth was lost forever or simply waiting for the right moment to surface.